It is now 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You have joined the webinar on how to respond to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the criminal justice system. To allow for some additional sign-ins past the hour, we will be starting this webinar in just a few minutes, so please hold on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program webinar on how to respond to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the criminal justice system. My name is Allison Upton, and I'm a project manager at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I will be moderating today's webinar, which is hosted by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. To give you an overview of today's webinar, first, we will do introductions of our panelists. Next, we'll hear from the ARC, who will provide us an overview of intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD as we usually say, and why IDD is a growing concern. The ARC will also provide information about the Pathways to Justice model and present strategies for addressing challenges faced by people with IDD and also criminal justice professionals. Toward the end of the webinar, we'll have time for questions and answers. And just a couple of housekeeping items, just as a reminder to the audience, anytime during the webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A panel, which is on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. This includes both technical and content-related questions. We will try to reply to technical questions in the chat window as we go. For the content-related questions, we will keep a running list and address them at the end of the webinar. We will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. If you encounter any technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues that you may not be able to resolve. However, we are recording this webinar and we will post it on our website by the end of next week. For introductions, I'd like to start with our first presenter, who is Leanne Davis. Leanne Davis is the Director of Criminal Justice Initiatives at the ARC of the United States, and she directs the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, or NCCJD. With over 22 years of experience working at the intersection of intellectual developmental disability and criminal justice, Davis continually strives to build stronger lines of open communication and understanding between these two worlds. She has authored numerous publications and presents nationally and internationally on a broad array of criminal justice and disability topics. In 2013, she worked with the ARC to secure funding to create the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disabilities, the first national center in the U.S. to adequately address both victim and defendant issues, and she oversaw the development of NCCJD's signature training, which is called Pathways to Justice. As the ARC's subject matter expert related to criminal justice and disability issues, Davis is often interviewed by national media outlets and provides consultation to a number of federal agencies and nonprofit agencies. Our next presenter is Maria Fryer, and Maria is a policy advisor for the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. She oversees the Justice and Mental Health portfolio and collaborates with the CSG Justice Center to assist states, local government, and behavioral health organizations to better understand the relationship between the criminal justice system and mental health populations, and to help create policy and programming that meets the needs of municipalities and the citizens they serve. Fryer previously worked at the North Carolina Governor's Crime Commission, where she advised the governor's office on effectively addressing the needs of victims of violent crime. In addition to working with families overcoming violence and instability in Coffee County, Alabama, Fryer has worked in community corrections in Fayetteville, North Carolina, helping to develop intermediate and community-based sanctions for repeat offenders with drug addiction. She also served in the United States Army as a member of the Military Police Corps. So I want to welcome you both and thank you both for joining this webinar today. Next, I'm going to give a little bit of background on the Council of State Governments Justice Center. The Justice Center is a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that combines the power of a membership association representing state officials in all three branches of government with the expertise of a policy and research team focused on assisting others to attain measurable results. Our staff develops research-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. This next slide describes a bit more about our work style and really how we strive to reflect Justice Center core values, which include a commitment to being independent and nonpartisan in every aspect of our work, providing rigorous, trusted, high-quality analysis, developing practical and innovative solutions informed by data and research, promoting collaboration and building consensus, and being inclusive and respectful of diverse views and experiences. As an organization, we focus on a range of areas within the justice system when we really pride ourselves in having a deep understanding of the experiences of people at the front line of the justice system and our ability to gather people from both sides of the aisle and across the country to foster collaboration. We promote smart and effective policy and practice changes through in-depth data analysis, on-the-ground training, direct assistance to state and local agencies, and dissemination of best practices and research. And now I would like to turn things over to Maria Fryer to talk a bit about the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Maria?
Great. Thanks, Allison, and welcome everyone to today's presentation. My name is Maria Fryer, and I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And the Bureau of Justice Assistance is a component of the Office of Justice Programs, also within the U.S. Department of Justice, which also includes the Bureau of Justice Statistics, National Institute of Justice, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, as well as the Office for Victims of Crime, and the Office for Sex Offender Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, Registering, and Tracking. BJA has four primary components. It has the Policy Office, the Programs Office, Operations, and the National Officer Safety and Wellness Office. And through these offices, BJA helps to make American communities safer by strengthening the nation's criminal justice system. It provides grants, provides training and technical assistance and policy development and services to states, local governments, tribal governments with cutting-edge tools and best practices. Next slide. And next, a little bit about the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program. The Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program is a grant and training and technical assistance program. It requires applicants to partner with mental health entities to improve public safety responses and outcomes. And it's for individuals with mental illness or co-occurring mental illness and substance abuse disorders who come in contact with the justice system. Per the authorizing statute, grants awarded under the JMHCP program shall be used to create or expand programs in the courts or specialized training, justice, and mental health at any point in the system or within intergovernmental cooperation. The legislative history goes back a ways, all the way to 2004, and it began with the Mentally Ill Offender Treatment Crime Reduction Act, known as MIOTRA. And then it was reauthorized once again through the 21st Century Cures Act, and it was amended and reauthorized the JMHCP program, which was first created by MIOTRA, and that happened in 2016. And ever since, the funding has dramatically increased to meet the needs over the years. In FY17, it was appropriated at $12 million and increased in FY18 to $30 million and has increased ever since. Although the legislation goes back to 2004, the program has been in existence and actually began the program that we know as Justice and Mental Health in 2006. The Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program has funded currently, including the new awards that will go out this October, has now included 560 new grants and awards. Grantees include local, state, and tribal enforcement agencies, counties, pretrial service units, health service departments, courts, prisons, and corrections departments. The program requires a two-phase process consisting of planning up to 12 months and implementation activities during which grantees will develop and coordinate approaches to implementing or enhancing services for justice-involved individuals with either mental illness or co-occurring disorders. And it has three purpose areas in FY20. The first purpose area allows for social workers or mental health professionals to be placed in law enforcement agencies to assist officers during encounters with people in mental health crisis. The second purpose area is for centers that provide assistance to those with severe mental health needs or who are at risk for recidivism. And the third purpose area supports law enforcement and prosecutors to respond and mitigate threats of targeted violence. And now I'd like to hand it back over. Thank you very much, Allison.
Sure, thanks, Bria. I'll actually turn it over now to Leanne to speak a little bit about the NCCJD. Leanne?
Hey. Hello, thank you, Allison and Maria. Thank you for that great introduction to the BJA and the program. And thank you to BJA for supporting the ARC to create the National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability. And again, a quick introduction, my name is Leanne Davis, and I work at the ARC and our National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability, and have been doing this work for over 20 years, really focused on how do we address the challenges faced by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as they come into the criminal justice system, as they leave the system, really all phases of that system. So some of you may not be familiar with the ARC, so I wanted to start with a little introduction of the ARC. We're the largest national community-based organization advocating for and with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. Really, our mission is to promote and protect the human rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and actively support their full inclusion and participation in the community throughout their lives. And this includes the criminal justice and legal systems. The ARC has about 600 state and local chapters nationwide, and we have had such a great opportunity. Although we've been doing criminal justice work for many, many years, in 2013 to get a grant from BJA to create this center. And what we do is advocate at the intersection of criminal justice and the advancement of disability rights. We are also fortunate to be able to work on both sides of this issue, which sometimes can be hard depending on funding streams, but we're able to look at this holistically, and we work on projects that deal with both victim witness issues as well as those who are charged of crimes, those who are already in the system. And this really gives us a unique vantage point to think holistically about this issue. Okay, here we go. So now I'd like to go into the next part of our program. First, look at our learning objectives. So what we're going to do today is really look more deeply into what is intellectual and developmental disabilities and behavioral health disabilities, because these can be confusing, especially when you're not used to, working within the disability field. And even for those who do, it can still be confusing. So we want to provide just some basic information on that. And then I'll talk about our Pathways to Justice model as one of the solutions that we are offering to think through how we can better support this community and really look at ways to also decrease the level of involvement in the criminal justice system. And then we'll use that model to address key challenges facing people with disabilities, and also looking at it in terms of professionals who are wanting to provide more support, understand the disabilities, and look at it from that vantage point as well. So before we get started, I wanted to provide a polling question for everyone. Hopefully this will help get your brains thinking about this. So let's look at this question. Under what category of disability does intellectual disability fall? Do you think it fits within, number 1, behavioral health disability, number 2, developmental disability, number 3, a mental health disability, which is also referred to as mental illness, 4, all of the above, or 5, none of the above? So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that poll. Okay, I think Eunice is now going to share the results with us. So it looks like we have about 80 people out of the 300 attendees that believed that developmental disability is where this falls. And then about as many people thought that that intellectual disability falls into all of these categories. So about 82 of you out of 296 participants believed that, and then quite a few with no answer. And I can probably tell you why that's the case. I was a little tricky here, and I have to I have to make a confession. I did make this hard because I really wanted you to think about it, and the actual answer is 1 and 2. So intellectual disability falls within both behavioral health and developmental disability. So the first term, behavioral health, includes the term neurodevelopmental disability, which also includes intellectual disability, and we'll go over that in the next slide. And then developmental disability is also one of those umbrella terms where intellectual disability falls under. Now, number 3 can be pretty tricky. So this one, the mental health disability, which we also refer to as mental illness, that ID or intellectual disability does not fall under that category. And that is one of the key issues that we'll be talking about today and why it's important to understand the differences. So apologies for making this a little tougher than I probably should, but I wanted you to hopefully remember, just the importance of this is not being perfect about knowing every definition about disability, but really having a general understanding so that when it comes to identifying and knowing how to communicate with people with different disabilities, we have a good foundation with which to work from. So just for a quick behavioral health overview, so behavioral health generally refers to the diagnosis that's in the DSM-5. So what you'll see within this definition are depressive disorders, substance abuse related and addictive disorders, personality disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders, and neurocognitive disorders. And as I just stated, intellectual disability would fall under the neurodevelopmental disorder. What those are impairments of growth and development of the brain or the central nervous system. And it really can include things like intellectual disability, specific learning disorders like dyslexia. It can also include autism spectrum disorders. So you can kind of get a sense of just how broad this term is when we're using behavioral health. So we're going to look more closely at those categories in the next few slides. But first, I'd like to ask Maria back to talk a bit more about how BJA is supporting training and education about intellectual and developmental disabilities through their various initiatives.
Great. Thanks, Leanne. Be happy to do that. We're very excited about some new initiatives that are almost ready to be rolled out or are in the process of being rolled out. And the first one is related to a collaborative project between BJA and the University of Cincinnati and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and this is an initiative called the Academic Training to Inform Police Response. The purpose of this initiative is to enhance existing tools, develop new products, and advance best practice models in law enforcement for people with behavioral health issues and developmental disabilities, including such model responses as crisis intervention teams and pathways to justice model, like we've just talked about here quite a few times, the co-responder model, mobile crisis teams, and case management approaches. And these are all referred to as multi-layered strategies between law enforcement and their service delivery partners. And so this is a project that will have a public presence very, very soon. The next initiative is the Police Mental Health Collaboration Toolkit, which is an online one-stop shop for law enforcement and their behavioral health partners. And this toolkit is established to enhance police mental health collaboration response strategies to help them to design one, to gather what's needed, decide on a model strategy, and really just walks them through the steps of actually designing and implementing a model strategy. And so this toolkit is currently getting some updates. We are going to be now directing viewers to more responses, including the Pathways to Justice model, and that will connect viewers that come to the site to more comprehensive models that do deal with intellectual and developmental disability. So you'll be seeing that real soon within the next week or so. Another initiative is a national initiative for law enforcement responses for health and safety. And this is a national initiative that's geared specifically towards providing training and technical assistance to enhance police responses to both people with behavioral health issues and intellectual and developmental disabilities. And this will be rolling out very, very soon. It's training and technical assistance that's provided through the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and we'll have a public-facing website that's going live within the next few weeks. So we're real excited about that. And then the last initiative that I'd like to mention, which is near and dear to my heart, and it's taken a little while to get up and running, but we are in our second cohort of grantees and a number of products and tools that are starting to just roll out very quickly now. And it's a project called Home Safe. And this project supports local and tribal jurisdictions and their efforts to reduce the number of deaths and injuries of individuals with forms of dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease, or developmental disabilities, such as autism, who due to their condition, wander from safe environments. You may be familiar with the legislation known as Kevin and Avante's law, which provided the funding that supports this initiative. So soon you'll be able to see this public website as well. And the initiative is called Home Safe, and the initiative will provide training and technical assistance and e-learning and resources and referrals and peer-to-peer learning. And this is being provided through the International Association of Chiefs of Police. So I want to give them a shout out for some of the great work that they're doing on this initiative. And I think we're going to have a slide a little later on in the presentation that recaps all that I just mentioned. So when you get to that slide, you'll refer back to my notes here, and I'm going to hand it back over to Leanne. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Maria. And yes, we'll make sure that everyone has access to all of these resources, and it is just great to know that there are options out there through BJA, through other areas where there's different supports for people with IDD in the community as well as mental health disability. So thank you for providing that overview. So let's jump back into intellectual disability, and I'll just go over some of the key definitions of the disabilities that we talked about previously. So intellectual disability is characterized by limitations in both intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. And it also needs to occur before the age of 18. So there's really got to be three major prongs when diagnosing someone with this disability. The intellectual functioning, also referred to as intelligence, refers to the general mental capacities such as learning, reasoning, problem solving, and so on. And one way that we measure IQ is through the IQ test. And generally, someone with an intellectual disability will need to have a score around 70 or as high as 75. So the highest score is between 70 to 75, and that indicates that there is a limitation in intellectual functioning. Another key area is adaptive behavior, and this really has to do with conceptual, social, and practical skills that are learned or performed by people in their everyday lives. And again, I mentioned that this needs to originate before age 18. Now, when we look at developmental disability, that's a much broader term. And according to the CDC, developmental disabilities are a group of conditions that occur due to an impairment in physical, learning, language, or behavior areas. And these conditions begin during the developmental period. They may impact day-to-day functioning, and they usually last throughout the person's lifetime. So you'll see that there needs to be limitations in at least three of these key areas that include self-care, learning, walking or moving around, self-direction, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. So to kind of put this in perspective, I wanted to provide this image here. And what we've got is in the middle circle, the term developmental disability. And you can see that around that large circle, there are a number of other circles that point to different types of diagnoses that fall under developmental disability. So at the top, we've got intellectual disability. And then as you go around, from Down syndrome to Fragile X to cerebral palsy, autism, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and epilepsy, the level of impact of intellectual disability actually can decrease. So why this is important to know is that while someone has an intellectual disability, they will also have a developmental disability. But for someone with a developmental disability, say like autism, they may or may not be affected intellectually. So this is important to keep in mind as you're working with people with disabilities. It's important to remember you can't make assumptions based on just what you see. And many disabilities can be hidden, and some people aren't comfortable sharing that they have a disability. So having a general knowledge about the different types and the terms that we use is very helpful for the criminal justice system. And before we get into more of the meat of the presentation, I wanted to really spend some time on this term intersectionality. This is something that we always provide in any of our presentations because it's such a key aspect of the work that we do and what's going on within the criminal justice system even today. And these are some of the statistics that we often will provide when we think about how all of the different issues, all of the different identities that people may have can impact how they are viewed, how they are treated, and just the level of how often that they get involved in the criminal justice system. So I wanted to also mention for accessibility purposes just some of the images that are here on the slide. So we've got a person of color sitting in the witness box speaking in court. We also have a female person of color walking down an aisle of jail cells with two correctional staff who are holding her arms as they walk together, and then a picture of a police car. And these images are really painting a picture specifically about the need to apply a lens of intersectionality to the work of policing and people with disabilities. And when we talk about that term intersectionality, it's defined as the oppression and discrimination resulting from the overlap of a person's different and multiple identities. So let's think about how that relates to the issues that we're discussing today, especially as we go through the entire presentation. And so some of the stats that we provide around this, one is that 55% of men of color with disabilities are arrested by age 28, but that's compared to 40% of white men with disabilities. Also, another one that comes from the Ruderman White Paper on media coverage in law enforcement found that people with disabilities comprise a third to a half of all people killed by law enforcement. So we have to think about, people's different identities and think about how poverty can increase the risk of violence and involvement in the criminal justice system, how marginalized groups in our society can often be seen as less visible, less heard, and how does this actually work against someone when it comes to getting involved in the system or as a victim of crime. So it's important to remember that people will have different identities. A victim or a suspect may be queer, Hispanic, and non-gender conforming, and we have to keep this in mind when we think about challenges that they're facing. And are they able to access the court system, victim advocacy services? This is something that we, again, will use that lens of intersectionality throughout this presentation. So now let's jump to looking at why intellectual and developmental disability is a growing concern. So overall, people with disabilities are overrepresented in today's jails and prisons and as victims of crime. They're often a hidden population, so they're not necessarily seen because they're not being identified when they're in the system. There can be confusion or misunderstanding about mental health and intellectual and developmental disabilities, and often they can be conflated together, and we don't have a lot of opportunity to talk about those differences. And so there also tends to be a lack of training around that. And they're more likely to be victimized or used by others in correctional settings. And overall, there is a lack of community-based alternatives. So let's get into some of the more specifics around each of those issues. As far as data, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities represent 4 to 10% of prison population. And I should add that all of the statistics and the sources for these are available at the end of the presentation. we did a white paper on the issue of juvenile justice issues and people with disabilities. And in that, we cited this statistic: 65 to 70% of youth in the justice system have a disability. So that's actually 3 times higher the rate compared to people without disabilities. And then an American Journal of Public Health article in 2017 found that young people with disabilities are 13% more likely to be arrested than their peers without disability. And then that figure actually jumps to 17% for Black youth with disabilities. So let's take a deeper look at the victim side of this issue. On the screen, I'm showing a picture of the legal scales. And in one side of that scale, it says that people with intellectual disability are 7 times more likely to experience sexual assault than those without disability. And this comes from an article that we'll talk a little bit more about later. But this is really focusing on the high rate that people with disabilities experience sexual assault. And this is data that we actually didn't have until pretty recently, around really helping us see the huge number of people being affected by this, and just consider the amount of trauma that people with intellectual disability are facing, and how are they getting services and supports around that. And then on the right side of the scales, we see that individuals with cognitive disability face the highest rates of violent victimization. So this data comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, where they looked at the different types of disabilities and who faces the highest rate. And they, what they deduced was that it was those with cognitive disabilities that faced the highest rates of violent victimization. And I will add that, and this may be hard to see, so I'm going to read this in the bottom, that how they are defining cognitive disabilities in this research is including Down syndrome, autism, dementia, learning disability, intellectual disability, and traumatic brain injury. So this is a broad definition, but it does get to why we need to think a little bit more deeply about how we're providing supports and services, how we're addressing these different types of crimes that are happening among this population specifically. And then moving down a little bit under barriers to justice, some of the things that we really train on and want to bring out around this topic is that reports of victimization are often not believed. The cases may go unprosecuted, and that's especially if there's any kind of communication challenges that the victim has, and also just an inaccessible services and supports in general, where people are not able to access, say, crime victim services or get to their local rape crisis center. There may be some serious problems with being able to access just the most basic services around crime victim needs. Now let's go to the other side of the coin and looking at suspects, defendants, and incarcerated people. So again, data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics shows that 2 in 10 prisoners and 3 in 10 jail inmates reported having a cognitive disability. And again, this is the most commonly reported type of disability. So we see that in both areas, whether the person is a victim or a suspect or incarcerated, that this is a high amount of people when we look at different types of disabilities who are coming into the system or who are being victimized. Another interesting note is that more than 25% of those later exonerated after giving a false confession to police had characteristics of intellectual disability. And this is actually one of the reasons why I started into this work many years ago. Back in the mid-90s is when there was a lot of focus on the high number of people who were giving false confessions, who had intellectual disability. And there was an amazing amount of work done around that to really bring out just how often that was happening, There was effort to look at how we were questioning people that had disabilities. And for more information, you can go to the National Registry of Exonerations, where this data is. And it has such implications not only for suspects and defendants and incarcerated people, but also for victims when it comes to doing forensic interviewing. So under here, we're going to look at the barriers to justice. And one is that the disability often goes unrecognized or it's dismissed as irrelevant. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities can often face higher rates of arrest, conviction, and longer sentences. And then they face inaccessible diversion and rehabilitation programs. So even when the programs are there, there's a question around how accessible are those programs. So given that we have all of these different challenges to face for people with disabilities in the system, we really wanted to start thinking about where do we even start, because it does feel pretty big. And we wanted to consider how do we comprehensively define all of these different issues? What kind of model could we use to address it? And I have a picture here on the slide of a Rubik's Cube, which has not been solved. And it's a good reminder that there can actually be a number of different ways that we can solve something. And usually we're not able to come to those conclusions all by ourselves, especially when systems intertwine. And there are a number of different professional groups involved in this issue. There are advocates, people with disabilities, and we really wanted to think about how do we bring everyone together around this. So in that effort, what we did is we took the sequential intercept model that was developed to look at the stages that people with a mental health disability progress through when they're going through the criminal justice system. And we overlaid that model with looking at intellectual and developmental disability. So this is really a way for us to work within communities, to have the conversations about what they are facing, what they see as being the key issues in their community. And I'll kind of explain how this works by going through the different stages. But first, I wanted to draw your attention to the steps on the model. So under steps, you can see that there's identification, accommodations, and support. So as we go through each stage of the model, from community to first contact and all the way through transition and back into the community, we're asking ourselves these three questions. Is disability being identified? How are accommodations being provided, or what accommodations are not being provided that need to be? And then where can we get support for this individual as we're working with them throughout the system? So this is really a way to kind of capture some really important data and information that maybe hasn't been thought about in any kind of systemic way before in communities. And it allows us the opportunity to take a deeper dive to be able to come up with potential solutions that can address this issue. So what Pathways to Justice training is really taking this model and allowing us to work with teams of people who can help address these issues. So I'll first talk about, though, a little bit more about our Pathways to Justice training, which is what basically the model allowed us to build the training off of. And the Pathways to Justice is really a comprehensive community-based program that creates and builds relationships between the criminal justice and disability communities. And this training program has two key elements to it. The first one is NCCJD providing support in creating this local multidisciplinary team that brings together key stakeholders from both the disability and criminal justice communities. And then what's really exciting is that these key stakeholders can work together to identify barriers to justice and serve as the go-to resource on criminal justice and disability. So from the criminal justice community, we would have a law enforcement officer involved, a victim service professional, a legal professional such as attorney or judge. And then we'd also make sure we have a person with an intellectual or developmental disability and other advocates such as family members or other supporters, and then someone from the disability community such as a chapter of the ARC or someone from an autism organization. So we want to make sure that we create this really broad group of people who can start addressing these issues together. And step 2 is then once that DRT is formed or the disability response team is formed, the NCCJD will work with the team to provide a full day in-person training that covers key topics such as how to identify, interact with, and accommodate persons with IDD and other disabilities. So what we realized, is that there is no way that training in and of itself is going to solve some of these really deep and complex issues that are facing communities. We knew that we had to just provide a way for people within the community to start having these really important conversations and to start working together and share that expertise across professions. Now, Pathways to Justice really got started in 2015. That's where, when we had our first pilot of the training. But today, since then, we've trained over 2,000 people in 14 different states. And in Ohio, we had the opportunity to provide our first Train the Trainer program that involved 4 different regions, creating disability response teams and then providing training in their local communities. So what I'd like to do now is ask you a question, since I've been talking a while, and find out from you, by using this Pathways to Justice model, what stage do you think poses the greatest concern for people with disabilities when they're going through the criminal justice system as a person who is accused or convicted of a crime? So we're looking at the side of the coin where a person has been accused, and not the victim, but a defendant or someone in the criminal justice system. So I'll give you a few minutes to think about that and then make your selection. Okay, so I think that the poll has been closed. And yes, here we go. It looks like there was sort of even answers across the board, responses across the board for different stages throughout the system, except for the only The only outlier to that was first contact. So most people chose the first contact piece of this. 87 of you out of about 300. And then 21 people said investigation, 25 said jail, 24 said the trial plea agreement, and then 8 said transition, and then the rest no answer. So I think this probably is pretty telling. It depends on where you are in the system and what you see, and the when you're coming in contact with people with disabilities. So depending on your role, you may pick a different stage where you've identified potential issues. And at NCCJD, we're really concerned about all stages, but we also recognize that prevention is key, and that often entails focusing training and education to those who have that initial or first contact with people with disabilities in the system. So thank you for answering that one, but I do have one more because I also want to get your thought about victims with disabilities. So let's move on to the next question. It's really the same question, but now we're focusing on victim or witness. So using the Pathways to Justice model, what stage do you think poses the greatest concern for people with disabilities when going through the criminal justice system as a victim or a witness? So let's take a few seconds to answer that one. All right, so let's see what we've got on this one. I'm not seeing it yet. Eunice, is it up? All right, there we go. So when we're looking at victims, what we see is that 73 out of 300, and that's where we have the highest number, is looking at the investigation stage. So for crime victims with disabilities, investigation seems to be a pretty important area to look at. There's about actually an exactly even number between first contact and trial or plea agreement. There is 11 people, so a smaller number around the jail phase. And so this kind of gives us, again, an idea of where it would be important to focus attention in looking at specific challenges for crime victims with disabilities. And there's really concerns across the stages. I mean, for example, how can we be sure that victims with disabilities feel safe to report victimization? And this can be seen at first contact. What are the barriers that they're facing to report different types of crimes? And then, as many of you said around investigation, we should be asking what are the accommodations provided so that there are no barriers with regard to communication. Because it may take a bit longer to conduct interviews with victims with intellectual disability, for example, and these types of accommodations need to be made available. And as far as the community, the last stage, we can start asking questions like, does the victim have access to healing services, to therapy, counseling, and is that counseling actually accessible? And often the answer is no, because we don't have a large number of counselors that have that type of expertise. So this has been really helpful to think about where, within your professions, within your work, with people who have disabilities, where you may want to focus in on looking at getting training, looking at getting support around these different topics. So now what I'd like to do is take all of the information that we've kind of gone over and look specifically at a couple of different case scenarios where we can apply these scenarios within the Pathways to Justice model. And I'd like to start with with Paul Gordo's experience. So Paul was an 18-year-old with autism who had become upset when he was at a library. So he was out with staff and other people with disabilities, and for whatever reason, something occurred that kind of upset him, and he ended up running into a person, an elderly woman who was out in the parking lot of this library. So he ended up being charged with felony assault, and the family members had mentioned that he was, learning how to control and work with these different outbursts due to sensory dysfunction that he was experiencing. Now, they had contacted us at NCCJD because they wanted us to be able to speak with the defense attorney, help the attorney understand the disability, and in that, they also wanted the family member also wanted them to understand, what was the true intent here, and to ensure that the disability was understood within the court system. So this actually resulted in a plea deal, and it was reduced to a misdemeanor. But I will say that that's not often the case. This was an unusual case in that Paul had family members who were advocating for him. And in many situations, when we get calls like this, we don't see people necessarily having advocates in their family or in other ways to be able to provide this level of advocacy. So what the family was really walking away with during the situation is understanding that critical needs in the system included quality defense and having ongoing programs that can really address the issue of disability, and not just a one and done type situation, but how can we provide ongoing supports within the community? So if we take that case scenario and we look at it in terms of the Pathways to Justice model, we can see at first contact how important it is for the disability to be identified. And in Paul's case, it was identified, and also it was more noticeable to the court system and to the criminal justice system. This is often not the case either. And as I mentioned, IDD can go hidden very easily. We know that people with intellectual developmental disability are often living in the community. Their disability may not be recognized at all until it's actually brought up through screening or through some type of testing. So it's important to remember that, because you may be working with people with disabilities that you don't even know that they have one. So keep that as something to remember, because oftentimes it does go hidden. Another step in the system is initial detention. So here we know that screening of intellectual and developmental disabilities is not universally provided. So that's something that, again, where this disability can be missed. With regard to pretrial and jail stage, the lack of pretrial services is often there, and we are not always seeing that attorneys are getting the training that they need around disability issues. Another challenge within the trial plea agreement is ensuring that accommodations are provided. And for example, if the person is involved in a mental health court, is that the most appropriate place for someone with an intellectual or developmental disability? And NCCJD at one point did provide a webinar on this topic, and invited different experts to talk about the pros and cons of having people with IDD involved in these types of courts, because what happens is there's not necessarily expertise or understanding around IDD specifically. And so it's important to remember that, again, those are two separate disabilities, and that we need to make sure that we're providing equal support to both communities. And then in transition, the issue here is that people with disabilities may not be able to be placed in other areas, and so they're held in the general population, and this can really compromise their safety. And then as far as the community stage, there's a lack of support during probation and parole. And, again, this goes back to the whole training issue, is how much training do probation and parole officers have when it comes to interacting with this population. So on the flip side, if we think about the solutions at each stage, we see at first contact that training and ongoing training for professionals is critical. In investigation, we want to ensure that effective communication is used through different types of accommodations like assistive technology. So the assistive technology is really any kind of assistive or adaptive or rehabilitative tools for people with disabilities that can promote their greater independence. So it could be anything from a wheelchair or other pieces of equipment. It could be electronic devices and software programs such as screen readers, and also communication boards where a person is able to touch something on a board in order to convey meaning about what they're trying to say. And we've seen this also being used within on apps now, where apps can be used between officers and others who have different types of communication needs. And really, this is a great example of how universal design is so important. And that means if we're designing something that works well for someone with a disability, it can also work well for a number of different other populations. And the more that we provide different tools like that, the more likely we can improve communication and how people are able to communicate within these different systems. And then pre-trial and jail, here a solution is to provide screening, and often what we'll see is like a shorter version of a screening to just be able to know if more screening is needed for that individual. And there's training that can be provided to attorneys, and that's part of what we provide through the Pathways to Justice training to really understand how they can provide those accommodations. Now, within the court system, again, accommodations are needed. And for example, if someone needs any kind of communication support, that can be used within the court system. And then consider, again, appropriateness of mental health courts. And if someone is going to be involved in that, are there people who are there who understand intellectual and developmental disability and can provide that expertise? And then transition, we want to consider the safety of people with developmental disabilities. Is there a way for them to be safe while they're in jails and prisons, and ensure that they have every opportunity to be able to have communication there as well. And then in the community, we want to be able to ensure community-based support. And again, this is something that we've heard whenever we do training with police, law enforcement, and through the DRTs, is that one of the things that often come up is that, well, we've done lots of training, but if we don't have ongoing supports, if we don't have solutions in the community, how is all this training going to help? So that's something that we know has continued to be an issue within communities, that we have to create community-based support for ongoing solutions. And now I want to look at a victim's experience. So this is James Metters, and his story was highlighted in NPR's Abused and Betrayed series that was published in 2018. And through that story, they worked with the Bureau of Justice Statistics to find this new statistic, which is that the rate of rape and sexual assault against people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is more than 7 times the rate against people without disabilities. And this has really helped to kind of galvanize advocates to see that, that this is, there was always understanding that this was an issue, but now to have the data, there's a lot more activity going on now around this issue nationwide. So if we think about James's story, and I do want to add that not only did he experience a rape in his own home, but he experienced 3 other sexual assaults throughout his life. And that's actually not uncommon for someone with an intellectual disability to have multiple instances of victimization. So in first contact, there's a clear need to outreach to the disability community, as many do not report victimization. They may not feel safe in doing so, and they may not know who to report it to. Within investigation, the interviewers often lack the training that's needed to provide those forensic interviews. Within jail, the victims don't necessarily know what their rights are. In fact, the disability community is not as aware of what victims' rights are and how to advocate for those victims' rights for people with disabilities once they become victimized. And they are often not prepared for trial, and they don't have an understanding of what to expect. Within the court system, again, it's important to provide those accommodations around especially communication. For transitions, I had mentioned that there's a lack of experienced therapists and healing services. So even once the person comes out of the system, they may have no access to any type of ongoing healing services, counseling, which is really, really important when it comes to healing the trauma that they've experienced. And then within the community, there's often no safety planning for how they will respond to future victimizations. So that continues to be a challenge for this community as well. So when we flip that over to thinking about solutions for each stage, for first contact, we're looking at developing more outreach to this community overall, and that can include training victim advocates and agencies, some of which are in law enforcement agencies. And we've worked with those different types of agencies throughout the country to really start brainstorming ideas of how can they do better outreach to this community, how can they be prepared to accept into the service system victims with disabilities, and then investigation to use skilled interviewers. And there has been materials out there around forensic interviewing and how to do that well when you're interviewing someone with an intellectual disability. And in fact, we're working on a project right now that is revising those materials and creating an online toolkit through the Office of Victims of Crime, where different types of professionals can go to really hone their skills in interviewing, as well as many other ways to better serve crime victims with disabilities. And then in jail, we want to make sure that victims really do understand their rights and that they're adequately prepared for trial. In the court system, to provide those really important accommodations like adaptive and assistive technology, and then transitioning to find qualified counselors or peer support. And within the community, to create a safety plan that helps them address, the risks that they face and to minimize any kind of risk for future victimization. So in considering just using the Pathways to Justice model and thinking through the different ways that either defendants or victims are moving through the system, here's some key takeaways to consider when addressing the issue of people with intellectual disability in the criminal justice system. It's important that we provide effective and ongoing training for dispatchers, law enforcement, legal professionals, and criminal justice professionals. It's also important to understand, though, that training in and of itself is not going to be the solution. We know that we need to also use a multidisciplinary approach, And that's why we really want to challenge everyone to also have disability response teams that can really focus on the core issues that are facing that community when trying to really support people with disabilities in their community. And then it's also important to know how to use accommodations to ensure that all people can access the criminal justice system. So it's important to know what those accommodations are, to work with your local disability agency to become more familiar with those, to work with your ADA coordinator within the court systems. There are resources out there where different professional groups can come together to really begin to work together and rely on each other to ensure that this particular population is able to access all the services that they need within the system. Now, for victims, it's important to increase awareness about just how high the rate of victimization is and the problem of underreporting. And we need to be cross-training victim and disability advocates to better serve this population, as well as improving outreach. And then to ensure accommodations are provided, and also not just to ask once about accommodations, but to ask the victim often as the person is moving through the criminal justice process. So overall, I think it's important to remember that those in the criminal justice system are not expected to become experts on disability. It can be overwhelming to give this much information and to know that there really can be so much nuanced information out there around disability issues. But what's important to remember is that there's not one profession that holds all the answers. And so it's important really to reach out to each other, to form teams who can really start to understand the issues within their own community. Also, to ensure that people with intellectual disability assist with training efforts. So in our Pathways to Justice training, as part of our disability response teams, people with disabilities themselves are part of those teams, and they assist with providing training just as other people on the team do. And it's so important to really get the firsthand experience, lived experiences of people with disabilities to the table, and that they are completely able to be involved in this process. That is really where you're going to get such good key information, and where new ideas can really be shared around how to move forward effectively, ensuring that people can communicate, and knowing that the whole community is involved in creating these solutions together. Again, no one person can do this alone. Everyone has a key role to play, and it's important to find out what your role is and be able to work with others in different professions to really address this effectively. And what's great, as we heard from Maria earlier, and as you've heard about Pathways to Justice, there are different tools out there. There's different ones being used now in the field, and there's some in development. So there's hope because we do have different tools. We do have a history of really trying to address this overall. And there are ways to work with different folks in your community in using these tools. So just an example of different ways that we've been helping through NCCJD, of course, providing the Pathways to Justice training that not only provides information on intellectual and developmental disability, it also creates these disability response teams that outlines an action plan that the community creates and decides on what are some next steps they would like to take in addressing this. We also have provided profession-specific training on intellectual and developmental disabilities, and we can also look to identifying people with disabilities as co-trainers, and then assist communities to create the disability response teams. And this is important because depending on the community, different folks might want to address specific challenges. So all of that is something that we've been helping with. Just a mention of our different resources and projects. You can go to our website there that's at the bottom of your screen, theart.org/NCCJD, to learn more about Pathways to Justice. Also, as I mentioned, a great resource that's coming early in 2021 will be this online toolkit for professionals on how to serve crime victims with disabilities. We have a project on our website called Talk About Sexual Violence that provides videos and information to healthcare providers on how they can talk about sexual violence to their patients that have intellectual and developmental disabilities. Another great project that just wrapped up recently is the People with Disabilities Foundation project, which provides information by people with disabilities to others about understanding better the criminal justice system and how it works. That has been a popular series for those with disabilities really wanting to understand this issue better. And then we've been part of an exciting international project called the Access to Justice International Hub that has allowed us to really look at how other countries are working on this topic of people with disabilities in the criminal justice system. And as part of that hub, we are looking at creating an institute where we can come together and share different things we're learning, different models that are being used throughout the different countries to really address this issue more comprehensively. And I just wanted to mention, too, this great resource. If you want to look this up on the internet, this is a resource that is just packed full of different information around criminal justice and disability issues. It came out in 2017, but it was just such a great resource because it gives you different perspectives of this issue, everything from family members who are, hoping that police can get training around autism to highlighting different programs such as Coffee with Cops and the Pathways to Justice training. So you can access that, and it's really easy to use online. You can just click on different articles that would be most of interest to you. So now that we've gotten through the presentation, I wanted to ask you one more, and I saved the easiest one for last. But I'm really curious to find out, given what you've learned today about disabilities, how likely are you to reach out for technical assistance regarding this topic? So the first one is certainly, can we call you tomorrow? Second, very likely if the need arises. The third one is somewhat likely if and when the need arises. And then fourth, not likely because it doesn't really seem to be an issue right now. So I think that's a great way to sort of wrap it up and find out from you if this is an issue that you're wanting to learn more about. So I'll give you a few minutes to answer that. All right, let's see what we've got. All right, so we do have some people that looks like they have immediate needs. And then most of you answered very likely when the need arises. So that's what we are here for. I know that BJA also has within their new center a way to get support for these different types of issues. And so I will pass it on now to talk about some question and answers.
Great. This is Allison. Thank you so much, Leanne and Maria. What a great presentation, just so much content to think about, and we really appreciate all that you presented today. So we've been getting, first of all, a number of questions about the great information that was provided and wanting to make sure people can access it afterwards. So I do just want to remind folks that we are recording this webinar. We're going to be posting it on our website, and along with the actual recording, we will be posting a downloadable version of the slides. So you will definitely have access to the slide deck and to all of the recording as well. Rest assured of that. And that's going to be found on our website, which is csgjusticecenter.org. So thank you so much for our presenters, and now we're going to begin the question and answer portion of the webinar. We're going to respond to as many questions as possible in the time remaining, and also we're getting a lot of questions, so we also just want to assure you that, first of all, as we go through the Q&A portion, we're going to be flipping through the remainder of our slides so that you will see our contact information for the presenters today. Please do feel free to reach out to us if we are not able to get your question today, because we're getting a lot of questions. But also we are going to be providing some other specific contact information for TA information, the National Law Enforcement Support Initiative for Health and Safety that we reported earlier, that Maria discussed earlier. We are, if anyone has any inquiries directly for that national initiative, we want you to please feel free to reach out to one of our colleagues here at the Justice Center. Her name is Alexis Lacey. She's a project manager, and we will be chatting out her contact information as well, so that if you have specific TA requests or inquiries, we definitely want to be responsive to you on that. So let's get started with the Q&A, because we have a lot of requests coming in. You can use your chat box as well. So to start with, there's a specific question about the first case scenario that you described, Leanne, in the presentation, the example of Paul. And so people were curious about why what he did was actually considered a crime and not an accident. So wondering if you could explain that a little further if possible.
Well, in this case, the person wanted to press charges, even understanding that the person had a disability. And so that at that point, that's when it became a crime within the criminal justice system. And actually, the family was pretty surprised that the charges were pressed. But these are the kinds of situations that we hear about quite often. And sometimes, you know, another issue that we see is just kind of suspicion of someone with a disability, maybe who's flapping their hands, they have autism, maybe they're wearing a hoodie and they're in a certain place and it could look dangerous to them. And, you know, we've seen that just calls within people who are fearful may call the police because they're concerned about what that could mean. So I think the point to Paul's situation and to so many of these that we're seeing is just more of a general education for society to understand that different isn't dangerous, and understanding how to, you know, look at situations through the eyes of people who have disabilities, through the eyes of family members who love people with disabilities, and understanding that in a different, you know, a different frame of mind.
Great, thank you so much, Leanne. And we're getting a lot of different questions about the Pathways to Justice training, so a lot of interest there. And people are wondering if you can share a listing of the states where the Pathways to Justice training has been implemented, or any information on how it can be accessed or requested in general. And also connected to that, given everything that's going on with the pandemic, people are wondering if there's any type of virtual model of the training, or if that's not possible.
Right. So I thought that would come up. and at this point, no, we're not, you know, we're not able to do it that way. Also, another challenge to that is that what's so key to the Pathways to Justice model is having that disability response team, and we really try to have people meet in person, especially the first time that they're having these conversations. And just during the pandemic, you know, that's been pretty difficult to try to do. However, we are looking at, you know, seeing how the pandemic has changed all of our lives and how we do, you know, how we get trained and all of those issues. We're thinking about different hybrid approaches, you know, how could it work to perhaps be able to do some social distancing around one of the initial points of contact together, but then looking at how to have the rest of it online. So we're thinking about different options there, but at this point in time, right now, we have it in person. And I can definitely provide you so that you can send out information about where we've already done the training and which states that has occurred.
Great, that would be very helpful. Thank you so much. Okay, and also informationally, people are asking about additional, your thoughts on any additional programs or assistance for those with IDD who are incarcerated and transitioning to release. People are concerned about recidivism, of course, and making sure that they get enough support. And I'm wondering if also in connection to that, people might like to know about local chapters of the ARC as well as any other resource, and how to find them and any other resources that you think would be helpful for reentry transitioning.
Yeah, that's a great question. So people can definitely reach out to our chapters, and on the ARC's website, which is www.thearc.org, you can look up your own chapter within your state, and depending on the chapter, you know, they may or may not be as involved in criminal justice advocacy. So a good place to start might first be NCCJD, and then we can help put people in contact with that chapter, find out more about, you know, to what level the chapter is working on criminal justice issues. And then with regard to like transition services and things like that, we often do look to our local chapters, and if there is a disability response team, look to them to know the community resources. As far as addressing it within probation and parole, I think we need to do a much better job at providing that kind of training. And I haven't seen that that's happening as much as, say, within law enforcement, where that first contact occurs. There's been a lot more focus on that piece of the system. So that is definitely an area of improvement where we need to focus more resources too within training individual professionals in the criminal justice system once that person has already come into the system.
Great, thank you so much, Leanne. And there's also a question about any resources that you might have for people with IDD, but around supported employment to those with disabilities. Any resources you could suggest in that area?
Oh, yes. So at the ARC, you know, we do provide a number of different supports for people. And I think I mentioned that at the beginning of the webinar. You know, within the ARC, we have a focus on education, on employment, and on a number of different topics. And employment has always been a key issue here at the ARC. There's just, you know, the rate of employment among people with disabilities is just so low. And it's something that we within the ARC are working on as well. So we've got some resources I can share through the ARC's website. And I wanted to mention too that we had an opportunity to create what's called the Justice Works program. And that was bringing together our Pathways to Justice training alongside of a program called Growth Through Opportunity. And what that program does is it brings people with disabilities into a local police department or sheriff's office to actually be able to have a cadet program where they come in and they work alongside the law enforcement, And the goal is not only for law enforcement to really get to know someone with a disability, not just like go through a training and learn what it means to have a disability, but actually get to know someone. And at the same time, the goal is to help that person actually get a job when they're done. So to me, you know, that really is a more comprehensive way of looking at this issue and saying, how can we do two things that's really missing within this issue? How can we create two solutions? And so I could also provide more information about that to anyone who's interested. I will say that because of the pandemic, we weren't able to complete that particular project because, you know, it involves people with disabilities going into the different law enforcement offices and going into the sheriff's department, and it just wasn't safe to do that. But we're looking at, you know, how can we potentially continue to recreate that, and it really just helps to provide that supported employment element for people with disabilities.
Thank you, Leanne. And I know we're at time, so we're going to have to stop, but we have a couple of key questions that we didn't get to in regards to resources for addressing the needs of people with IDD when they're in custody, and also around suggestions and considerations for assisting around court processes, sort of understanding your court requirements, you know, perhaps around the legal processes, et cetera. So I don't want to shortchange those questions. Maybe we can go to the contact slide once more and make sure that folks, please, if you could reach out to us directly, we will be able to respond to these additional questions. And we just appreciate, I wanted to say thank you again to our presenters and our attendees. It was a great webinar today, and we really appreciate all of your participation. We hope you have a great rest of your week as we wrap up today. Thank you so much to everyone, and take care.